Condoleezza Rice persuaded the president, as we understand it, that she should be allowed to testify. And when they made that decision to allow her to testify, which surprised us, and indeed to allow the commission to have a, quote, meeting with the president and the vice president, they sent us a letter.
Hi, I'm Mike Hurley.
I'm Barbara Gruey.
We're the hosts of the Are We Safer Today podcast. In this podcast, we speak with members of the 9/11 Commission staff about their unique experiences in the investigation into the 9/11 attacks.
The 9/11 Commission was chartered by Congress to investigate the most significant attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor. Supporting the work of the commissioners, the commission's staff was tasked with reconstructing a complex jigsaw puzzle. What led to 9/11? What happened on that day? What should we do about it? But unlike a typical jigsaw puzzle, the pieces were not in a box. There was no image of what the solved puzzle would look like, and many of the pieces were missing. I'm Barbara Gruey.
I'm Mike Hurley, and this is the Are We Safer Today podcast. Last episode, we talked with Dieter Snell, whose team was tasked with investigating the 9/11 plot. One of the main challenges Dieter had to address was how to effectively work with U.S. and foreign government agencies to obtain the information his team needed. In this episode, our guest is Dan Marcus, General Counsel of the 9/11 Commission. Among Dan's many responsibilities was negotiating the rules governing those agency interactions. We were a commission created by Congress charged with investigating the executive branch. There were issues of separation of powers, executive privilege, precedent setting, and good old-fashioned turf fights. Someone had to blaze a path through that maze to get results. Dan was that person. Before joining the commission, he had a long career as a partner in a major Washington law firm and in senior positions in the Carter and Clinton administrations, the last of which was as Associate Attorney General, the third highest official in the Department of Justice.
We would like to thank our sponsor, Carnegie Corporation of New York. The philanthropic foundation supports innovations in education, democratic engagement, and strengthening international peace and security. Learn more at carnegie.org.
We would like to thank the Wilson Center for sponsoring the Are We Safer Today podcast. The Wilson Center is the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue to inform actionable ideas for the policy community.
Dan Marcus, welcome to the Are We Safer Today podcast. As you know, we're speaking with members of the 9/11 Commission staff about their experience in the investigation into the 9/11 attacks. Let's begin with the job you did. Can you tell us what your role on the 9/11 Commission staff investigation was and what you were responsible for?
Well, as General Counsel, I was really in charge of the investigation. Part of my responsibility was talking to the heads of the various task forces or groups, whatever we called them, and keeping track of what they were doing. Along with my deputy, Steve Dunn, we reviewed and edited all the document requests and subpoenas that were drafted by the lawyers working for us. By the way, one of the things I had to do when I came to the commission a couple of months after it had started was to persuade the executive director and the chairman and the vice chairman that we needed to hire more lawyers, which they agreed to do, and we had a wonderful staff. But what I didn't know was that I was going to spend an awful lot of my time dealing with the White House lawyers who, on access to witnesses, particularly senior administration officials in the Bush administration, on access to sensitive documents like the famous presidential daily briefs. And it was very time-consuming and difficult, but it was fascinating. The other thing I didn't know was that the Bush administration was going to insist that interviews of senior administration officials could be conducted only by the chair or vice chair or by the executive director or the general counsel. So I spent quite a bit of my time with interviews of senior Bush administration officials. Philip Zelikow, who was the executive director, had worked on the transition at the NSC for the incoming Bush administration. And so it was decided that he should not interview Bush administration officials, senior Bush administration officials.
Because of possible conflict of interest
Yes.
or appearance.
Appearances, yes. Indeed, he had written a book with Condoleezza Rice.
Who was the national security advisor at the time.
Correct. So I got to interview Condoleezza Rice and Steve Hadley, the deputy national security advisor, and several cabinet officials, John Ashcroft, the attorney general, Colin Powell, the secretary of state, some other White House officials like Andy Card, the chief of staff. And it was a great, took a fair amount of time, but it was a great experience for me.
Two questions. You said that you had made the recommendation to the chair and vice chair of the 9/11 Commission that you needed more lawyers. What was the reason behind that? Was that a set of skills that they would bring to the investigation?
Yes. I mean, if you're going to have lawyers who are reviewing documents, interviewing witnesses, trying to get information out of people, you need lawyers for that. And the several of the commissioners who were very interested in the investigation side of the inquiry as opposed to the policy side of the inquiry, which other commissioners were very interested in, backed us up and were very helpful in recruiting some terrific lawyers. I think we ended up with a staff of about half lawyers, as I always said, about half regular people.
You talked about the White House and the administration, the Bush administration insisting that only the chair or vice chair interview certain people. Was that kind of a status thing from their point of view, or what was sort of their
I think it
purpose in
was.
that?
They were very sensitive about precedent. They had two obsessions, the White House lawyers. Behind the scenes, I think there was a great influence of the vice president and his lawyer.
And the vice president was Dick Cheney at the time.
Yes. And they were obsessed with executive privilege and also with whether they were establishing a precedent in dealing with the commission that could be used against them and other presidents, other White Houses in the future in dealing with Congress. Because the commission, which was, as you know, a statutory commission, was located by statute technically in the legislative branch.
So created by Congress.
Created by Congress. And so the White House lawyers took the position for a long time that anything they did with us was a precedent for dealing with Congress because we were a legislative animal. And I got blue in the face arguing with them that separation of powers, while it's very important for the executive branch in dealing with Congress, didn't really apply to us. We weren't a legislature. We couldn't pass any laws. We had a very narrow mission, and it wouldn't be a precedent. And the irony is when they finally decided that for a long time they refused to allow senior White House officials like Condoleezza Rice to testify publicly before the commission. We were allowed to interview them privately, and that was very important
but
to
not
us.
call them interviews.
Not call them interviews, that's true. We had to call them meetings. They had all sorts of silly rules like that so that they could say to themselves and to a future congressional committee, oh, we didn't allow an interview of the National Security Advisor. That was just an informal meeting. Condoleezza Rice persuaded the president, as we understand it, that she should be allowed to testify. And when they made that decision to allow her to testify, which surprised us, and indeed to allow the commission to have a, quote, meeting with the president and the vice president, they sent us a letter saying, we want you to agree that this is no precedent for our dealings with Congress, and which was sort of humorous because who cares what the 9/11 Commission says about whether it's a precedent for dealing with Congress? But we happily sent them a letter back and said, as we've said all along, the commission is very different from the Congress.
I'd like to go back in time a little bit. How on earth did you end up being the general counsel of the 9/11 Commission?
I was interviewed first by Lee Hamilton,
He was the vice chair of the
vice
commission.
chair of the commission,
And a Democrat.
who learned about me apparently from a former partner of mine whom he knew, who recommended me, who knew that I had just finished teaching for a year at Georgetown Law School after I had been in the Clinton administration, and recommended me. I was interviewed by the chairman, too.
There were some commissioners who really wanted someone who could be a junkyard dog and really go in and fight. And that was never sort of your personality. Was your approach strategic in being less adversarial, or was that just who you were?
That's a good question. I don't know that I'm the best qualified to answer that. I think it was a combination of those two things. And indeed, we had some difficult issues to resolve along the way as to whether to really go to war legally with the White House when we were getting stiffed on stuff, or whether to continue to try to work things out. I think, in my mind, it was partly a function of the limited time we had. At various points, one or more commissioners wanted to subpoena the White House. We should subpoena the White House to force them to produce Condoleezza Rice for a public hearing. We should subpoena her to appear at the public hearing. Later, it was we should subpoena them for the presidential daily briefs that they were not willing to give to us. And this was all fairly late in the game. It was in the winter or the spring of 2004, and we had a deadline to produce our report coming up in the early summer of 2004. We got a short extension from the Congress. The White House ended up accommodating us. We didn't know whether they would or not, both on testimony by Condoleezza Rice, public testimony, and also working out a deal with us on the presidential daily briefs.
So you mentioned that the White House eventually caved. Why? They could have stonewalled, knowing that there's no way that even if you issued a subpoena that there would be time. They could have run the clock. Why did they change their mind?
They changed their mind, I think, because of two things. One, Richard Clarke probably was a little disgruntled that he was getting shoved aside in the Bush National Security Council. He had had a very close relationship and a significant role in the Clinton administration when Sandy Berger was the National Security Advisor. An example of that is we discovered when we got documents from the National Security Council that we were allowed to get memos from Richard Clarke to Berger. But the White House took the position, not unreasonably, that communications directly to the president are kind of at the core of both executive privilege and national security issues. So we could not get a memo from Sandy Berger to Bill Clinton. We could not get a memo from Condoleezza Rice to George W. Bush. But we could get memos from Richard Clarke to Sandy Berger or to Condoleezza Rice. And in the Clinton administration, we learned through our interviews that Berger just sent on Clarke's memos to him to the president. So in effect, when we saw these wonderful memos from Clarke to Berger, we were seeing what went to the president. I mean, no one had ever heard of the presidential daily briefs until the 9/11 Commission came along. They were top secret, only seen by the president and a few other senior officials. I should say the presidential daily briefs are the documents prepared at the time by the CIA.
This is the CIA's most prized intelligence product.
Yes, and they are delivered in person to the president. Well, it depends on the president. I think President Clinton just read the PDBs. George W. Bush, by contrast, like to get his input orally from the CIA briefer, and George W. Bush developed a very good, close relationship with his CIA director, George W. Tenet, who was one of the few, if only, holdovers from the Clinton administration. In any event, the pressure on the presidential daily briefs was what led them to finally make a deal with us, which we exploited to the hilt. We were granted limited access. Only one commissioner and Jamie Gorelick and Philip Zelikow, our executive director, were allowed to look at the ones that were responsive to our document request. The other commissioners didn't get to see the actual presidential daily briefs.
We would like to thank our sponsor, Carnegie Corporation of New York. The Philanthropic Foundation supports innovations in education, democratic engagement, and strengthening international peace and security. Learn more at carnegie.org. We would like to thank the Wilson Center for sponsoring the Are We Safer Today podcast. The Wilson Center is the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue to inform actionable ideas for the policy community.
So, you're talking about, sort of negotiating access to people and documents and all of that. And I think one of the things that you mentioned, and particularly I know Jamie Gorelick, when she was looking at the PDBs, they objected to the level of detail of her note-taking. I know that there were other members of the staff who they thought had taken too many detailed notes. Were there sort of even discussions down to that level of how detailed could we be when we looked at something and brought that back?
It's amazing how many discussions we had with the White House lawyers about that. Their initial position was that these sensitive documents, particularly the White House documents, the NSC documents, we could not get copies of them. We could view them, we could see them. The commissioners and a limited number of staff members could go look at them, review them in a SCIF, a secure, Mike, you know what the compartmented information facility. And they established a SCIF for us, and we were allowed to take notes. But there were two big restrictions. One, we could not take the notes back to our office. We could go back and visit them in the SCIF later, but we couldn't take them back to the office. The second restriction was, this was written down in another agreement, the notes could not be so detailed as to virtually recreate the document. So Mike Hurley's chief lieutenant for reviewing this stuff was a young guy named Warren Bass.
A PhD in history and scholar, yes.
Scholar, a researcher whose business was taking detailed notes. So there was a constant battle because when one of the White House lawyers would go to the SCIF and look at Warren Bass's notes, he would see they weren't, on several occasions I would get a phone call saying, damn it, Warren Bass has recreated the document.
Well, I think my recollection is that Warren and Jamie Gorelick sort of got around that a bit because they had such good memories that they would write up the notes and then they'd run back to the office and recreate the notes at the office.
If not recreate them,
get the essence, down.
And Philip Zelikow has a prodigious memory as well, too, for sure. Dan, I want to explore and go back just a little bit. Barbara and I have talked about this in our own reflections on the commission, that there's the usual Washington game, right? The commission, for example, the White House could view it as, like, what are they up to? They're going to produce a report that, politically is bad or dangerous for us and so on. And so parties sort of retrench, and they can be very difficult, and that can often be the game. And so in figuring out this, what we've termed a puzzle, the investigation, putting together the puzzle of the 9/11 attacks, a big part of your piece in that puzzle, your role as general counsel was kind of figuring out how do we get this done within this, year and a half time frame?
Yeah, we got very, very lucky, too, I think, because the public hearings caught the attention not just of the families, but also of the American people. It sort of reinforced our political power. The White House ended up having to worry about us. They started out very nervous about the commission. The Bush administration had opposed the creation of the commission. And we got it through thanks to John McCain and Joe Lieberman, that dynamic duo. They pushed it through the Senate and shamed the House into approving it.
A Republican and a Democrat.
Yes. I think that as we went along, the Bush administration increasingly, despite all our disagreements and battles, became convinced that maybe the commission was not out to get them. And one of the things that helped convince them of that was that we were clearly going after, we were clearly conducting a serious review of the Clinton administration's counterterrorism policies and policies in al-Qaeda. And we were asking for documents. They saw what we were doing, what we were asking for. And indeed, I think one of the reasons our report ended up having as much credibility as it did was that it was an equal opportunity critic of both administrations in terms of counterterrorism policy. Politically, of course, that had a greater impact on the Bush administration. But I do think as time went on, they got confidence in the staff of the commission, particularly. They were comfortable with Tom Kaine and Lee Hamilton. They worried a little from time to time about some of the Democratic commissioners. But in general, I think they were impressed as we went along with the way the commission handled itself.
I have a question about the hearings because you said the hearings made the commission and you gave examples. But there was also a public hearing that threatened the commission when John Ashcroft testified and came in with a bombshell and declassified a document and accused Jamie Grelick of causing 9/11.
Yes, that was a real ambush. We asked all witnesses, and I had interviewed John Ashcroft. It was a very good interview, and he was very responsive and very didn't live up to his tigerish reputation.
So Dan, just to set the stage, and so that's the private interview that was done of, and we always had private interviews of everyone before they actually appeared publicly.
Correct.
So then there was a round of public hearings in early March 2004 of the highest level officials, the cabinet level officials of both the Bush and Clinton administrations. I mean, it went on across an entire week or longer than a week, I think, Barbara. And that's what you're referring to when the Attorney General, John Ashcroft, was...
Yes. Yeah. There was an acting FBI director that summer, during the summer of threat of 2001. And in an interview with the acting director, Tom Picard, he had said that John Ashcroft had told them to stop briefing him about al-Qaeda threat. He didn't want to hear it anymore. And Ashcroft was unhappy about that. There were other issues that come from various other commissioners, but he didn't have anything on the other commissioners. But Jamie Grelick had been the Deputy Attorney General, so he was able to find an old document and surprised everybody by having it declassified over the weekend, coming in and throwing it down the gauntlet and saying the biggest cause of 9/11 is sitting right up there.
Yeah, and the document related to this so-called wall between intelligence and the FBI.
What was the wall?
The law enforcement.
The theory was to protect the integrity of intelligence information, you couldn't allow that if the FBI was doing a criminal investigation of a matter which was still an active matter in the intelligence community, that you had to keep separate the intelligence information from the FBI information so that you wouldn't compromise some later prosecution. But basically, Jamie Gorelick, when she was Deputy Attorney General, had continued this policy, which had started before her. There had already been in the public sphere some discussion about whether this wall between intelligence and criminal investigation had somehow prevented the FBI from discovering stuff that would have prevented 9/11. It was a bunch of baloney, really. There was never any reason to think the wall had anything to do with the inability of either the intelligence community or the FBI to be effective on counterterrorism or al-Qaeda issues.
Barbara, you're a real expert on this issue. What are your thoughts?
In fact, I wrote a monograph about the purported wall and how there are still people who think that Jamie Gorelick, A, created the wall, and that the wall caused 9/11. But again, I think the fact is it did backfire. And I'm forgetting which commissioner it was, but there was one who, Jamie wanted to fight back, and he put his hand on her arm and said...
Oh, right away,
Yeah, and
it was
said,
probably
Slade Gordon. Slade Gordon says, I got this.
One of the great things about the public hearings is they really... and I don't know if we knew it at the time when we decided to do this. They helped us write the report. Right. Because very early on, I don't know if it was the first public hearing, but we decided that there should be a staff presentation at the beginning of each public hearing to sort of set the stage for the hearing. And I remember that, Mike, you and a couple of your colleagues, I think it was probably Alexis and Warren, I'm not sure, at the beginning of the big hearing where Richard Clark testified, I think it was that hearing, you gave a staff report of what we had found so far relating to the counterterrorism policy. And it not only did those staff reports give each working group a leg up in drafting the report, but it also made you famous for 15 minutes because somebody in the New York Times wrote a column about how, remember these names, Mike Hurley, whatever it was.
No,
do you remember that?
I do. David, the conservative...
David Brooks.
David Brooks wrote that, and the title of it was See Dick Run, I think. It was... He was contrasting what he thought was the objective staff statements that my team had done with the spin that he believed that Richard Clark had put on his sort of presentation.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was quite interesting. But Dan, so let's talk a little bit more because I think it's fascinating. There's different perspectives on this, but you were deeply involved in the editing process of these all-night sessions that we had. And for the audience to know that staff statements are statements that are produced in advance that go hand in hand with a public hearing, and it's on a particular category of issues. It's sort of the statement of findings of what the investigation had done up to that point. And so they become public documents, but getting those right and as accurate as possible was a monumental task. At the time, the public was, the families of the victims of 9/11, the public were so interested in the work of the commission. And I think one area they were interested in was, although they kind of misconceived the purpose of the commission, but the public often thought of, who is the 9/11 commission going to blame? Is it going to be Clinton? Is it going to be Bush? How is that going to be apportioned?
The families and the public wanted to know, Did Bush drop the ball? Did Clinton drop the ball by not responding to the attack on the USS Cole in October of 2000? The families, and this was a source of some tension with the commission, the families didn't trust the government. The families had not been politically active earlier, but they learned fast, as you indicated. They learned through the long process to get the commission created by Congress. They were concerned not only with sort of responsibility of senior officials, they wanted to know what guy in the CIA dropped the ball and is responsible for my husband or my son's death. What guy in the FBI failed to find those two guys in San Diego and should be drawn and quartered? And I remember Vice Chair Hamilton saying very early, we're not interested in that. We are interested in the system failures. We are interested in what went wrong, not interested in whether Sam Jones or Bill Smith is personally responsible for not finding out that Moussaoui was in Minneapolis taking flight lessons or whatever.
And commission leadership would often cite the language of the statute that created the 9/11 Commission, its mandate, and as I recall, was to investigate the facts and circumstances surrounding the 9/11 attacks and to make recommendations to keep the country safe. It didn't even empower the commission to sort of say, this person deserves 10% of the blame and this,
right.
Whatever. So,
well, and the fact is that the failures that we found were the product of years of the way the intelligence community operated in the United States.
We would like to thank our sponsor, Carnegie Corporation of New York. The philanthropic foundation supports innovations in education, democratic engagement, and strengthening international peace and security. Learn more at carnegie.org. We would like to thank the Wilson Center for sponsoring the Are We Safer Today podcast. The Wilson Center is the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue to inform actionable ideas for the policy community. In your role as the General Counsel, you've talked about a number of the sort of day-to-day negotiations and things that you had to deal with. We've talked about one of the curveballs, which was the Ashcroft accusing Jamie Grelick. I think one of the other curveballs was the whole story with National Security Advisor Sandy Berger and how that created a major kerfuffle. And if you can sort of talk about how you dealt with that.
Well, I assume what you're referring to is something we didn't know about at the time, which was in preparation for his interview by the commission, which must have taken place in late 2003 or early 2004. I think it was January 2004. We didn't know this, but in preparation for that, Sandy Berger went to the archives to review where all the Clinton administration documents, including the NSC documents, resided, and which we had access to as part of our investigation, but that weren't available to the public at that time. He went there to review his stuff. And apparently, as was learned later, after the commission was over, we learned that he had been investigated by the Justice Department in connection with his unlawful removal from the archives of a document that he had written while he was National Security Advisor. Either he had written or had been sent to him by his staff.
Produced under him in some way.
Produced under him in some ways about counterterrorism plans or plans relating to al-Qaeda. I don't really remember. And he apparently, I'm speculating here, he stole this document in a Keystone Cop caper. He stole the document from the archives. One can only speculate. I assume his motive was so that we wouldn't have it to ask him questions about it at his interview. Well, we had it. We didn't have it in our possession, but we had reviewed it at the archives because the archives wasn't dumb enough not to make copies of all these things before they made them available for our review and his review, which was entirely separate. So when we didn't learn what the document was till much later, or I didn't at least, when he was prosecuted and pled guilty to a misdemeanor. And we were surprised because we didn't think the document was so important, and we didn't think it was so embarrassing to him, but apparently he did. And it was a tragedy because he was a very diligent and respected public servant, and his reputation and post-government career was sort of ruined by this.
And we issued a statement, I think, at one point making clear that whatever he did had no impact on our investigation in the sense that we did get to have access to the document, and it didn't slow us down or mislead us in that sense at all.
Yeah, I think that may have been issued afterwards by the successor organization. I don't know, or by Hamilton and Kane.
I was actually called in by the FBI that was investigating whatever it is that he had done, the removal of the documents, and questioned, just having to do with merely, in my case, that I was part of the team that interviewed Berger when he came to the 9/11 Commission spaces. So they just wanted to know, and I didn't know what the investigation was about, but I could tell from the questioning they were interested in some document or other that Berger had been connected with.
Early on in the conversation, you talked about not wanting to issue subpoenas because the clock would run out. But you made some exceptions to that. And why did you make those exceptions?
Well, we issued a couple of subpoenas, one to the Federal Aviation Administration and one to NORAD. Early on, we were dissatisfied with we issued document requests to all the agencies, and most were quite responsive. The FAA, and I don't know whether it was incompetence, because it wasn't like they were holding back stuff that was so damning to them or anything. Once we got it, it turned out to be nothing all that exciting. I think it was incompetence, and NORAD I don't know enough about to know. The commission, I think, felt it was important to lay down a marker that we weren't going to just go away and take whatever the agencies gave us. So the FAA was sort of the test case, and we issued a subpoena, and it turned out, and I was a little surprised, and it shows you the power of the subpoena. It got a lot of attention in the press. A number of the commissioners talked about the importance of issuing the subpoena, and they fell all over themselves trying to give us the stuff. NORAD was a harder decision because I think a harder decision for the commission, and I don't want to reveal votes on the commission or anything, but it was a closer question, and I think it was a closer question because Donald Rumsfeld, the legendary Secretary of Defense, lobbied the commission on this, but he failed. And we did issue the subpoena, and we got what we thought we needed. Of course, that was one of our most successful investigations that followed on that, where we learned, we were able to show that contrary to the Pentagon's claim after 9/11, that if the flight 93 that crashed in Pennsylvania, that if the passengers hadn't forced the plane to crash in Pennsylvania, that the jets that had been scrambled to intercept the plane on its way to Washington would have gotten it before it got to Washington. And our intrepid investigators were able to show that no, they wouldn't have gotten there in time for a number of reasons.
So you've talked about a number of your successes by taking this almost Columbo approach to talking to the White House and all of that. Were there any fights that you lost that you regret?
Well, one that I lost in the commission, but worked out well, so I should have lost, I guess. I thought it was crazy, and the commission did it. I think it was Dietrich Snell, who was the head of our task group on the Al-Qaeda plot. He got it in his head that we ought to be able to go to wherever the high-level detainees were being held, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and his brethren.
These were people that CIA or the military had captured out in foreign lands and were holding.
We're holding in secret sites. We didn't know where they were, and we didn't know anything about the sites.
And
at
the
the
thought
time.
was they might have information about the actual plot.
Oh,
the 9/11
sure.
plot.
But it was obviously a logical thing to do in the investigation. But my reaction was, this is crazy. Of course they'll never let us do it.
Their concern was that the introduction of any outsider, no matter how knowledgeable about the questions to be asked and so on, could disrupt or somehow interfere with the rapport that had been built between the people that were holding them and the prisoners themselves.
Right. And of course we had no idea at the time about what the prisoners were being subjected to perhaps make them more malleable in interrogations.
That's a good way to put it.
Philip and Dieter were very agile. So when they finally realized that they weren't going to be allowed to interview these people themselves, they said, well, let us come and watch you interview them and about the plot so that we can evaluate what they're saying. And they said no. And we had a big discussion of this at a commission meeting. And I said I thought this was crazy, that CIA would never allow this. But the commissioners, much to my surprise, decided to authorize us to push the interview issue. And I think they had a meeting with George Tenet. Hamilton and Kane met with Tenet and pushed this idea, and Tenet was scandalized. But it worked. Not that we got to go to the secret sites and watch the interviews, but the CIA finally came back with a counter proposal, which we grabbed onto, which was they said, you can submit questions that you want to ask these guys, KSM and the others, to us, and we'll ask them. We'll ask your questions, and we'll give you the answers. And what they ended up getting from them, they gave us the intelligence reports. And if you look at our report, there are a lot of citations to those in our report.
Dan, stepping back and thinking about, there's an entire generation now that wasn't even born when the 9/11 attacks occurred and aren't familiar with what a devastating blow that was to the country and how it changed so many things, or the work of the 9/11 Commission. And what lessons or thoughts, reflections might you have to share about why the Commission worked, what its legacy is perhaps, and especially we're in a pretty, I think it's safe to say, polarized time now. But we had this, what I think is pretty amazing bipartisan leadership of the Commission, and your reflections on that, I think, would be important for young people especially.
Well, we were very lucky that we ended up with Tom Kane and Lee Hamilton as the heads of the Commission, because they not only were they an effective team, and each of them brought different experiences and strengths to the job, but also they were senior statesmen, and they had the stature to bring what could have been a fairly partisan commission, because there were 5 Democrats appointed by the Democratic leadership in the House and Senate, and there were 5 Republicans, 4 of whom were appointed by the leadership in the House and Senate.
None of whom were shrinking violets, by the way.
Right, that's correct. And some of them had partisan instincts. Kane and Hamilton were able to, in a sense, shame the other commissioners into curbing their partisan instincts, I think, and producing a unanimous report, which is really remarkable.
When I think about the commission and and I actually give a lot of this credit to the chair and vice chair as well, too, but because we know there were disputes among the commissioners along the way. Like, you were witness to these, as we were as well. But the constant emphasis to the staff to find out the facts, be as accurate as possible, be as precise as possible, and if you just lay out the facts, that's what we'll present. We'll present the narrative, and then people can draw their own judgments. I wanted to ask you, I was in the room, as I think Barbara was, and I'm sure you were, on the day that the commission voted on the final vote to publish the 9/11 commission report. And for me, it was a pretty exhilarating moment just to sort of see that. I wanted to ask how you felt, I guess, when that happened.
Well, a sense of relief and gratification. And the other thing that was very gratifying was the press conference that the commission had when the report was released, which was sort of celebratory and serious. The commission, because it was regarded as a success, we've become a model that people cite. The legislation to create a January 6th, 2021 commission was modeled on our commission. It was the same kind of appointments system, and the debate on that, the bill didn't pass, as you know. It got a majority but didn't get 60 votes in the Senate. The debate, everybody was falling all over themselves saying, we're using the 9/11 Commission as a model. The same thing is true. There's now discussion, and Philip Zelikow, our executive director, has been very involved in this project. Originally, it was the idea would be a privately organized commission, but now the focus is on legislation to create a commission to investigate how our government has handled the pandemic. And it's a fascinating, and the 9/11 Commission, again, is the model. And it's sort of a parallel because performance of the government involves two administrations, one Republican, the Trump administration, and the other Democratic, the Biden administration. And if this commission is ever created, like us, I'm sure that despite our polarization, maybe they'll find a way to make it work.
I think the leadership, as you cite, is so key. And Barbara, any reflections?
I think the reason that we became the model was because we were able to do something many other commissions were not able to do, which write a report that captured the imagination of the public and get legislation passed shortly thereafter. But I think one of the interesting things to me was that after the report was issued, that the families came together as well.
Yes.
And they were not always unified in their approach and what they wanted. But when we issued the report, the families came together and said, this is the right thing to do. And so I think in so many ways, we accomplished things that no other kind of commission had done. It takes the right leadership, and it takes the right staff.
Dan, it's been a pleasure reuniting with you and hearing your thoughts on these really important issues.
Pleasure was all mine.
Thank you, Dan. Dan's work in coordinating the Commission's external relationships paved the way for investigators to obtain access to information critical to the Commission's success. For example, he helped facilitate access to people and documents from the CIA, one of the most secretive organizations in the world. Imagine being an outsider and having to navigate the halls of the CIA. In the next episode of the Are We Safer Today podcast, we'll be hearing from Alexis Albion, a 9/11 Commission staffer who had that very challenge.
Did, at any point before 9/11, the CIA have the authority to actually kill bin Laden? It sounds like it should be easy to find out, but it wasn't.
Alexis's piece of the puzzle was investigating CIA covert actions against al-Qaeda before the 9/11 attacks. Join us as we continue to explore through the eyes of investigators the most extensive investigation in U.S. history.
Thank you for listening to the Are We Safer Today podcast. This was made possible thanks to our sponsors, Carnegie Corporation of New York and the Wilson Center.
I'm Barbara Gruey.
I'm Mike Hurley. This is the Are We Safer Today podcast. Thanks for listening.
If you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to check out the Are We Safer Today documentary film. In it, the 9/11 commissioners discuss their historic work, what they did and how they did it. Available in broadcast or streaming from your local public television station or pbs.org/video. Special thanks to the Center on Representative Government at Indiana University, along with Paul and Cindy Simon Scott and the Sumerian Foundation. Are We Safer Today is a production of Naptown Media. Executive producer Bob Massey. Produced by Shelby Hiltunen with associate producer Emily Twergle. Editors Matt Massey and PJ Wilson. Recorded at Interface Media Group in Washington, D.C. with sound engineer Dennis Jacobson. Thanks to Sarah Jackson and Grant McPollan. Theme music by House Music and Sound.